The Second Great Awakening, APUSH Unit 4 by Carla Brautholz and Natalie Helbig. Woo! Overview. First, we will have vocabulary with key terms in the Second Great Awakening. Second, we will have the Great Awakening, explaining what the Second Great Awakening was. Third, we will have religious movements resulting from the Second Great Awakening. Fourth, we will have reform movements, what reform movements resulted from the Second Great Awakening. Fifth, we will have in-depth, which will look into the different types of reform movements from the Second Great Awakening. Sixth, we will have key points to remember from the Second Great Awakening. Vocabulary. Protestantism, a branch of Christianity that follows the theological tenets of the Protestant Reformation, a movement that began in the 16th century with the goal of reforming the Catholic Church from perceived errors, abuses, and discrepancies. Temperance, in its modern use, is defined as a moderation or voluntary self-restraint. It is typically described in terms of what a person voluntarily restrains from doing. This includes restraint from revenge by practicing mercy and forgiveness, restraint from arrogance by practicing humility and modesty, restraint from excesses such as an extravagant luxury or splurging, restraint from overindulgence in food and drink, and restraint from rage or craving by practicing calmness and equanimity. Arminianism, a school of theology based on the teachings of Dutch theologian Jacob Arminius, for whom it is named. It is perhaps most prominent in Methodist movements and found in various other evangelical circles today. It stands in contrast to Calvinism, with which it has a long history of debate. Antebellum, occurring or existing before a particular war, especially the American Civil War. Evangelicalism, movement among Protestant Christians who believe in being born again. Second, what was the Second Great Awakening? The Second Great Awakening was the Protestant religious revival that occurred between the years 1795 and 1835. It included both religious, moral, and social reforms, and it led to the founding of many colleges and seminaries. It was considerably less emotional than the First Great Awakening, as it was a revival of it, and it led to the organization of mission societies throughout the U.S. at the time, and it emphasized salvation over predestination of Calvinism. Movement. The religious movement was largely led by Charles Grandison Finney, who is often referred to as the first of the professional evangelists, as he was previously a lawyer. Finney used the same methods of pleading when speaking to the masses of a congregation as he did when pleading to the juries as a lawyer. He was very convincing. He emphasized the cause of salvation and the cleansing of one's sins rather than predestination. The religious movement saw the reformation of many Presbyterian churches into something a little more emotional, and also saw the shift from Calvinism to Arminianism, as it preached God's grace rather than the ideas of predestination and pre-chosen people by God.
Reform movements. The Second Great Awakening sparked evangelical Christians to address and eradicate social problems that arose from westward expansion. Between religious conflicts, participation in voluntary and social reform work was a common goal. These actions were led by ministers, but mainly carried out by middle-class women. These voluntary societies printed and distributed Protestant tracts, taught Sunday school, distributed outdoor relief, and evangelized frontier towns and urban slums. These actions led to important social reform projects, such as the temperance movement, abolitionist campaign, and development in women's rights. Reform societies. To summarize, there were many reform societies, and people could choose which to participate in. Examples such as the Temperance Society, who dealt with the drinking problem in America, and more reform societies, who wanted to end prostitution and redeem what they called fallen women. Voluntary associations also worked to reform bankruptcy, laws, prison systems, insane asylums, labor laws, and education. They also built orphanages and free hospitals and developed programs to provide services such as social work, job placement, and day camps for children living in slums. Here we have a picture of the Eastern State Penitentiary, which changed the principles of imprisonment. They focused on reform rather than punishment. The structure of the prison is called a panopticon surveillance system, which allows all prisoners to be seen from the guard tower, hence focusing on reform rather than punishment. In depth, the temperance movement. Among all the social reform movements, the temperance campaign was the most successful. This reform wanted to decrease the consumption of alcohol in America due to it becoming a significant social issue after the American Revolution. At the time, whiskey was cheaper than milk and beer and safer to drink than water, so alcohol became a common beverage in lower and middle class households. By the 1820s, alcoholism was an epidemic and was visible in most towns and cities. Reformers claimed that full abstinence of alcohol was needed. Evangelical ministers organized the American Temperance Society in 1826, which supported lecture campaigns, produced temperance literature, organized revivals that encouraged worshipers to give up alcohol. Within a decade, it established 5,000 branches and gained over 1 million members. Temperance reformers pledged to never drink alcohol, encouraged others to join, and influenced lawmakers in several states to prohibit the sale of liquor. Women had a significant presence in societies dedicated to eradicating liquor due to the perception that men frequently drank and abused, abandoned, and neglected their families. This is an illustration of the temperance movement, showing the tree on the left to be surrounded by snakes labeled brandy, gin, rum, wine, beer, and cider. There is one big snake choking the tree labeled alcohol. The branches are dead and labeled disease, misery, insanity, and poverty. In the background, there are people fighting and there is a broken home. The colors are also duller than the illustration on the right. The tree on the right is more colorful. There is a family in the background that is going to church together, and the tree is healthy, and the branches are labeled health, happiness, prosperity, strength of mind, and strength of body. The abolitionist campaign and women's rights. Evangelical reformers believed that slavery was one of the worst sins and that it reflected poorly on the moral virtue of the United States. Baptist William Lloyd Garrison pushed the idea of the immediate emancipation of slaves onto Northern reform agendas. He believed that he could convince the enslavers to release their slaves because of Christian consciousness. Another famous advocate for anti-slavery was Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave. He wrote and told the story of his life in slavery, making known the injustices done to slaves and convincing others that slavery was wrong. Women played one of the most important roles in advocating for all reform movements during the Second Great Awakening. Female reformers strongly advocated for the abolitionist movement and women's rights. They were also recognized for being responsible for family life and the education of their children. This led to them arguing for education because if women were to educate their children, they needed to be educated as well. This asserted women's intellectual equality with men. Key points. It is important to know about the temperance movement, abolitionist campaign, and the development of women's rights during the Second Great Awakening.